back, I was thinking to Anne Boyer, who we were talking sort of informally before this reading. We sort of realized that Anne was in Sheffield in 2019, a conference organized by Dan Eltringham, who's here today, Poetics in Commons, which was a 2 or 3 day long, fabulous sort of series of events and readings. And I think Anne was reading on the 3rd day with a giant turnout as well. We are incredibly privileged and honored, but also personally me hugely grateful for you accepting the invitation amidst multiple levels of turmoil. So really just a really heartfelt welcome to you. And the way the event is going to run is the usual schedule. So I'll introduce briefly our reader, and then Anne will be reading for about, you will see what you feel comfortable with, 45 minutes or so, 50 minutes from old and new work, poetry, prose poetry, nonfiction, etc. And then after that, I mean, time is rather limited, but I will kick off with the Q&A with my usual meandering, spiraling, never-ending non-question to Anne, and Adam will follow me with his own question, and then if you have got the time and energy, we can
some of the things that I want to look at. We're spotting these kind of convergences, and I'm
a 10-15 minute conversation from the floor, questions from the floor, if you're happy with that, but we'll have to obviously limit that, and perhaps the best way of doing this is you jot things down into the notes, into the chat box, and Adam and myself can sort of read them out, unless you really feel brave and confident enough just to come forth and ask away anyway. So without much further ado, let me introduce Anne Boyer, who is a poet and essayist from Kansas City. Her books include The Romance of Happy Workers, My Common Heart, Garments Against Women, A Handbook of Disappointed Fates, and The Undying, which is a memoir about cancer and care. Anne's honors include the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in Nonfiction, the 2020 Windham Campbell Award, the 2018 Cy Twombly Award for Poetry from the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, a 2018 Whiting Award in Nonfiction and Poetry, and the 2018-19 Judith E. Wilson Poetry Fellowship at Cambridge University. Anne Boyer is an associate professor of the liberal arts at the Kansas City Arts Institute, where she teaches literature, philosophy, and writing. Warm welcome to you once again, and also to all of you who've turned up today. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Last night, I had a nightmare that wouldn't end, that I forgot about this reading because there was a pandemic and war, and I think also the internet was down and the electricity was cut off, and I only remembered when it was too late that I had this other thing I had to be doing, which I think is probably a lot of us are feeling right now, these multiple pressures of the world. And so I particularly appreciate you coming to hear me with all this other stuff going on. I think I'm going to read primarily new work today. I'm going to start with a couple of poems and then read from this ongoing kind of unidentifiable prose thing that's part journalism, part prose poetry, part meditation. And I think I'm probably going to read some parts I haven't read out loud before for anyone. We'll see how everything goes. So I'll start with a couple of new poems. This one's called During the Flood. We were the doom-scrolling animals, opulent wreckers of elephants, hands on our glistening cameras, suckers for literal vestiges. I was a prophecy hooligan. Yours was a swaggering, etc. He was of dubious radiance. She had a terminal cheer. But we were all melters of ice caps, Lucifer's fail sons, dank little tragedies. We were all calico sea monsters, killing with protean courtesy, wild as each terrible remedy, drinking from filtering taps. Yet the best were like one with all hillbillies, hiding in the faltering juniper, praising the smog-bitten shrubberies, knowing all providence temporary, leaving this world like moonlight, okay with the fading and fine with the day. This next one, so I've been trying to write sapphics, which is a notoriously impossible metrical scheme in the English language, which is why it's been so tempting to try to write them and to learn about their history. And I have to say that what is really helpful is Allen Ginsberg, when he was at Naropa, taught an entire workshop on sapphics and managed to find almost every notable example, actually both good and bad examples of sapphics in the English language, and make a little handbook for his students. And so I found transcripts of those talks, and then the archivist at the Naropa Institute helped to give me a copy of all of his teaching materials. And so it's been a kind of fun way to explore this poetic form, but also to sort of look at the teaching and writing of these other generations of writers. So the sapphics I've been writing are it's just these ongoing stanzas. So perhaps not quite to the level of a finished poem, maybe like a very long project. And I'm going to read from some of them as today, which is the first time I've read these out loud. The meter is wonky. It's supposed to be. It tilts and surprises. And so here are some untitled sapphics. Day demands its animals eat their leaves and birds their seeds, that prophetic sedges stand on riverbanks, some murmuring songs in green notes down to the hard roots. Night demands its animals burn in thickets, stare up high at cold-fired shadows, dark retainers clinging to have-beens, ghastly fortitude wilting. Stars and night and truancy, oh, oil-fed cities tilting at air, that tragedy looming over all hours, highly after all in set time. We were once meteoric, planting suns and angles, velvet cloaks on backs, bangled wristbands. We had emerald brooches, sapphires, ruby toe rings, ambulance, heartaches, this charnel Byronics, angels swinging with household gods. But up next, the stars premiere in patterned access. Up next, nights of leftover dreams on tile floors. Up next, ceaseless divinatory whooshings, hallways. Up next, indolent afters when the winter pheasants eat on the grass and grains and starry sinks. The animal banquets rise and finally break off. Up next, starlings rustle low to the weeds left tall and dry. The nature center is empty today. Walkers walking there in the callous light of theories they won't say. And the moon was tired of looking at all this, wanting the futureless future here now rather than the swaggering past, this conquest. And Sappho wrote that militants creep in myrtle groves and snack on divinatory olives. So waste the night and waste the day. They're both losers, burnouts getting their vengeance. time, of course, then quantity. This art makes both. I'm going to read from the prose work now that doesn't have a title yet, or it has like 100 titles. So this first part of it takes place in Sedalia, Missouri, which is about an hour and a half east of Kansas City. On the courthouse steps of Sedalia, Missouri, population 21,738, a few hundred people raised our middle fingers to the sky. This was not to flip off God, that the God who let the cop kill Hannah probably deserved it, but to flip off the drone that hovered overhead and to which we all shouted, "Fuck the police, fuck the police, fuck the police." How are they affording drones to watch us when they say they can't afford a $100 body cam to watch themselves? So we shouted at a drone who had no ears and flipped off a drone who had no eyes. We did this with many hands. The drone had none. We shouted for Hannah, 25, on her way to work the night shift at the Eagle Stop convenience store out on the highway, unarmed, slight-bodied, recently promoted, pulled over by a sheriff's deputy, shot in the face 5 times within a few minutes of the stop. The cars parked around the courthouse square were painted in bright pinks and greens of a small town celebration, but they said, instead of "We're number 1" or "Class of 2020, Hannah's family deserves answers," and "Gone but not forgotten." Wheelchairs and rascal scooters were decorated too, and people came with children and pit bulls and chihuahuas, and some mothers vaped on a bench and said between themselves, "I've already made peace with God about what I'd have to do if the cops murdered one of my babies." Pickup trucks and motorcycles roared by, honking and revving in support, but one truck growled up and coal rolled toward the crowd, releasing black jets of coal smoke in an ambiguity that was the day's ambiguity. And Hannah's boyfriend arrived at the protest as the crowd had rushed from the courthouse to the sheriff's office, where the sheriff and his deputies had barricaded themselves. They were yelling, "What's his name? What's his name?" because there's no one who would say the name of the cop in Sedalia who killed Hannah. It was an unmarked car, the people in the crowd said, that had pulled her over, and a young woman in a long denim skirt yelled, "God is real, and you dirty cops better repent because he's coming for you." They were pressing signs against the glass door too, signs that said, "Police the police, and the law is not above the law." Hannah's boyfriend moved toward the front of the protesters, the crowd who now chanted, "Hannah, Hannah, Hannah," so her name echoed off the buildings of Sedalia's worn-out downtown. 2 young men stood near her boyfriend as he spoke to the crowd, intoned "fuck the police" at the end of everyone's sentence. Everyone yelled back from the crowd, unpracticed and protest and raw, shouting out, dashing to the courthouse steps to yell a thing, dashing back into the crowd. "They killed my friend, shot him on his own porch. They'd kill you in your own car, even if your kids are in it. They'd kill any of us for any reason. And a judge and a badge don't make you a god. They don't even make you a damn man. And they wonder why we run when they have guns or at their back. And as long as they've got their guns, we've got ours." Hannah's boyfriend said that if the cops want to say they aren't bad, then they should prove it by stepping forward and turning the bad ones in. He then looked at the sky and shouted, "Hannah, where are you?" And that was that. Silence, handing off the megaphone, pushing away from the steps. He moved through the crowd, waiting for Hannah to answer. We stared to the heavens for a few seconds, the drones still marring the sky's blue promise, Hannah still killed, our rage still fomenting on earth. That's when we began to shout, "Hannah, Hannah, Hannah." Her name less an exhortation than a question without answer. Hannah is free, one of the protesters yelled, but she ain't here. We called her, but she could not come back. Farewell, you cartographers of galaxies, extractors of crude, bombers of cities, choppers down of trees. Farewell, you eaters of sandwiches, champions of springtimes, competitors in verse. Goodbye, the militant, fey, and perverse. The locus of understanding, what they once called man, had seemed so confident in itself, but soon trembled, then wilted, then faded. There were so many problems, but one was the terms we had been given to understand the world. These were supposed to be the human terms, politics, art, economics. But the new desires, when they emerged, suggested that we could be greater if we learned to be less. Our desires began to bend toward the vegetative and angelic, or toward the demonic, astral, geologic, and divine. Man was not the measure of all things. Man was no longer even a measure of man. What was art versus a lightning bolt illuminating a flower? Stars, when they shined, preferred to do so for the cormorants and the remaining tigers. The world, as we were born into it, was a fire that wouldn't burn hot and true again. It was an extinguishing age. All kindling is the stuff of hope, and the present kindling was dumb with its hope, also despair, as it was also ragtag and doomed. When we tried to restore the fire, whatever we fed to the flames made its noxiousness worse. The Gladware lids melted into fumy misery. The Discover card statements burst into ash. Modernity had sounded good in theory, but it always had some appalling gaps in execution, not the least of which were the conditions of each who failed the universal type, which was almost everyone in the whole world. And underneath its life was the death it bore from its beginning, the contradictions and crises inscribed into the world from modernity's birth. There was the morbidity of its fuel sources, the leaking poisons of its industries, the star-crushing gloom of its electric lights. A world that obliterated the stars with its off-pits was a world that could not and should not endure. The way to move forward in the new sublimity, this technical term for the arc of obsolescence of a way of life, was one foot in front of the next, doubting the reality of our own toes. It's the forced march of future ghost, which is difficult enough for those who can bear to recognize it. But then the march sped up weirdly, and it took on the tempo of a line dance. The singer of the song of the hour called out, "To the left, and 1 step forward, 851 step back, then shake it like a Polaroid picture, then genuflect to an absconded god, then curl up like a woodlouse, then overrun the Capitol, then fall to your knees and weep." All over the world, the living had paid for yoga classes where they laid down in corpse pose above the earth, and the corpses laid down in corpse pose beneath it. There were floods and fires, dust clouds and locusts, riots and extinction, the great looting, the great lies, the great disease. But not every apocalypse is a lamentation. Some are ascents to heaven in chariots of fire. It's only, however, that in this one, each micro-Noah was a tech bro staring into his phone, avoidant as any arc postponer standing knee-deep in the flood. The ascetes praised the beauty of the ascendant stock market. The scribes were disassociated, writing, then deleting, then writing, then deleting, then writing their errant chronicles. These errant chronicles also wilted. First as farce, next as farce, yet again as farce, one more farce after that. In the next revision, tragedy, next is tragedy, again is tragedy, one more tragedy after that, which remained a tragedy, eating farce for breakfast. And chronicle, even as a word, implied a sort of fealty to time, which itself had totally absconded. The only word that really worked anymore was errant, which clung like a poisonous and jealous cloud. The calendar account was erased, and after that, the Dear Diary version. It became the art of fractional thought, self-aborted forms, distractions, panics, nightmares, every paragraph fantastical incompleteness. The writing was, like the writer, shit at focus and totally distressed. The isolation that came to be required in those days had made any hypothetical self-coherency look, in retrospect, like a joke. Most hadn't had a dream in months, only the word freedom, now a euphemism for death and qualitative easing, crying out in the dark. There's no party, only a sinking ship and a lifeboat from which we are supposed to push each other. It took a tremendous capacity for subterfuge to assert oneself as a personal pronoun while going for weeks without seeing another person. This would have been a lie, and there had to be absolute fidelity to the truth, at least in the part trying to describe why so many of us believed our feelings produced the world. But how we came to believe our feelings produced the world depended on when and where anyone was born and to whom and how much money anyone had or could get. It was limited then to those who could, once it started, have a feeling and click a button, then have what they desired materialize as an object or a set of objects delivered contactlessly to their door. Tacos, dildos, and ponchos. Or hand towels, talcum powder, and honey. Or his and her respiratory mask, silk-screened with the word "O." The dizzyingly obfuscatory methods of circulation and distribution of consumer goods were only one of the ways in which some were led to believe that it was their feelings that produced the world. But this alone was a powerful deception. The global distribution of labor, the supply chain, the comedy of corporate shells hiding under corporate shells, the contractors of the contractors of the contractors, the cool interface of the screen, the genital compulsion of all of us who stroked it, these brutalized farms and factories and families as sites of concrete truth. Those who wished for strawberries, and in 2 hours could find their doorstep adorned with strawberries, mistook themselves for gods, in a way, which they were, in a way, or at least the blithely vicious kind, mostly bored and unaware of the trouble that falsies can bring. It wasn't just their feelings this class believed produced the world, but also their thoughts and wills, their innovations and their organizing, their critiques, their accounting, their enumerating. They developed surveillance systems and algorithms to memorize the habitual desires, to predict and seed their future desires. They loved risk and its assessments, mindfulness, thought leaders, vision statements, and strategic plans. I gave away an arsenic green vintage Givenchy suit. I gave away embroidered tea towels, a Bush era SUV. Having determined Black garments were the garments of those in authority, of priests, judges, and intellectuals, I gave away the grim and authoritative quadrant of my wardrobe. And having decided that sweats were the humblest of all clothes, I then gave away my full closet, gave away dresses and silk blouses and corduroy pants. I sent packages of my once prized possessions to strangers in California and in New York. I gave up email, social media, news feeds, television, movies, podcasts, opening the mail, cashing the checks, and answering the phone. This fit of asceticism began before the pandemic began. It began like every spiritual tale, like St. Francis or Don Quixote began. Somebody gets a wild idea, their clothing style changes, they develop special feelings for birds. I meditated daily on death, considered astral substance, saw my hunger bend the hinge from the appetite for knowledge to that of wisdom. I wanted to know why, under the weight of death and inside the cruelty of our species, anyone lived. I studied ancient Greek. And then I got poison ivy for the first time in my life, despite years in the garden. And it traveled through my veins and set everything in me on fire. And during this period, medicated into oblivion, I extracted pigments from plants. I forgave the poison ivy. I contemplated materiality, the secret chemistries of color, the volatile, the fugitive. To forgive is to wear a garment of water which dilutes all poison that comes one's way. To inhabit the pain of those who have or would harm you. The steps beyond dilution into transmogrification. And I learned a lot about pigment and transience and beauty. But also I learned it might not be that good, all this giving up, all this meditation, all this distance, for how it loosens one's bonds to the earth, which is the place, after all, where we all must live. Everyone was losing their minds all around, and the more clearly mad were those who went about their business as usual, the ones who kept doing their jobs. It didn't mean it was better to do no business, only that now we needed to find a better kind. If we had to be bound to materiality, we should choose better tethers. Beauty, perhaps, is the halfway point between the carnal and the otherwise, and with it love, which seemed like the earthly enactment of what they once called God, and both involved some earthly substance to temper the astral kind. And after that, my sweatpants started to look ostentatiously pious. What I started out with was a profound apathy toward the human world and a hunger for something else. And perhaps what I acquired were two things, and all they demanded of me: belief in what was once called the soul, and the conviction that self-deception was the root of all that used to be called sin. And I'm skipping many chapters of this tale, like the one called Victor Surge, or The Streets, or The Capside Kayak, or the Russian novels, or what I call the Croesus month, which was the one in which I learned to understand why people really love gold, that it retains its texture and appearance and its processes, its fire and liquidity and its solidity. But ultimately, I watched Elizabeth Taylor in that movie, The Driver's Seat, dressed in circus colors, encountering Andy Warhol in the airport, putting on her absolute makeup, wandering around in exploding Rome, looking for the man who would kill her precisely according to her plan. The absurdity was not Elizabeth Taylor. It was Elizabeth Taylor in this world. She searched for death, the very precise aesthetic terms in which she might escape the world she found unlivable, the world of stain-resistant fabrics, macrobiotic diets, and rapey men. And in the movie, the sun bleaches everything but Elizabeth Taylor, and the camera is horny for ruins, and any vestigial wisdom is to be found in broken statuary. Now I watch an Elizabeth Taylor movie more days than not, usually the art house years, preferring the ones the critics despised. And in matters of writers with spiritual manias, I noticed what happened to Gogol, deranged and burning Dead Souls Volume 2 twice and being no closer to heaven for it and barely any warmer. Better to admit that along with Don Quixote's sorrowful face, I am in love with the middle-aged version of Elizabeth Taylor, who's like a cat who has been given every can she meowed for, yet stares coolly at the universal can opener, insists that each can has hitherto been a pate of emptiness, and demands more. How much time do I have? All right, I'm going to read a fable now that I've read. From parts of the fables. So there's a selection of fables that go with the prose. So it's the book's in two parts. So the last part of the book's just called Relevant Fictions, which is a bunch of fables and stories. And I don't know if my publisher is going to find that acceptable. But I'll do what I can. Oh, you know what? I'm going to read this one about shit. I apologize in advance. It's just about shit. I'll explain it in advance too. In writing it, I leave the explanation for where it comes from until after it as a surprise. But there's a footnote in Kant's essay called "The End of All Things," and it's a really interesting essay about why we always want to imagine that the world is ending. And this particular custom of modernity, of Kant's modernity. And he's got a joke in a footnote about ideas about the shitty condition of Earth. And one of them, which is clearly drawn from Sufi philosophy, is the idea, this little fable about how the world's just a toilet. And so this story is then built on that footnote about the toilet world that Kant took from some wiser, funnier Sufi philosopher. It's called The Excrementalist, a fable. We'd been wrong about the beginning of the world. Eden was not on earth. It was on the plane of heaven. And while Adam and Eve wanted to taste the forbidden fruit, the fruit was different too. It didn't confer wisdom, only just stubbornness. It was the only fruit in paradise, which did not, when eaten, dissolve. An angel offered to solve Adam and Eve's dilemma, who each had intestines, an illicit hunger for illicit fruit in a paradise with no toilet. Problem solved. They ate as they liked, and they flew with this angel to what he claimed was the bathroom of the universe. While they were doing their business, the angel flew away from them, never to bring them back. The bathroom of the universe was Earth, and it was from this first couple, the Excrementalist, that all of us have descended. After eating the forbidden fruit, everything the first humans consumed turned to shit. The tender insides of mollusk, the bloody flesh of wild boar, the grains ground into mush, the milk of the ungulates, the berries growing on brambles. When the first children were born, too, both Cain and Abel were bathed in fluid tinged with their own waste. This waste, called meconium, formed in each human fetus thereafter in the 12th week of gestation, the same week that fingernails grew from the nail bed and the sex organs emerged. This triumvirate of human folly, shitting, fucking, and fighting, arrived in its embryonic form to each embryo concurrently, and it still does. Full of shit, sometimes even eating it before the first gasping breath of air. All of the descendants of the first pair of us were born, also mixed up in the waste of our mothers, human life always emerging from the same place. Unsurprisingly, encomium, an ancient term for flattering speech, is an anagram of meconium, the shit we are full of at birth. All of our species have been excrementalists. Lao Tzu, Socrates, Gertrude Stein, each was the attendant of turds. All the nameless saints and rebels, shit's consorts and companions. The most noble of all of us is born full of shit, born amongst shit, and shit's most day of their lives. The wretched and the mediocre do too. The only non-shitters on the historical record were those who, like the ancient Israelites, subsisted for a time on the angel food of manna, or the opium enthusiast who, having grown fatally bored with this world of shit, refused to eat. Only a heretic would believe that Jesus himself, either before or after the resurrection, could save humanity without ever once squatting. And even the Last Supper moved through someone's bowels. And those who believe that God and shit are incompatible have a meager understanding of both. We developed technologies for our waste, trowels, holes, hand sanitization. We issued edicts concerning it. Our waste commingled in gutters and sewage plants, landfills and trash heaps, the major and minor waterways. We made bathhouses to clean ourselves, the water sometimes heated with pages torn from the books of our great libraries. There were bidets, outhouses, vault toilets, flush toilets, water closets, urinals, and holes dug with spades. I do not know a book that could, no matter the dazzling elucidations of its interior, resist serving a future function as toilet paper. And once settled into our earthly home, this terrestrial grandstand, the megacosm's toilet, it was not only the food that our species ate that turned into waste. All we touched appeared to do the same. We were born so helpless, so adorable and adoring, and we remain that way so often throughout our lives that we compensated for our weakness by acquiring for ourselves and those we loved the materials of this earth, not just at its surface, but deep within its gills. Our industries digested all the earth as we digested our food. We mined, drilled, harvested, slaughtered, and concocted until we could fill the holes we had dug back up with the waste we had made from what we dug from them. Even now, this project to let nothing go untouched by human hands, undevoured and undigested by the gargantuan cupidity of the first fallen couple disembarked to their earthly toilet goes on. The cursed descendants of the first excrementalist have always desired to subject the earth to manufacture as a moth desires a star. In the hands of our species, the snow becomes snowmen, the flowers become wreaths, the sheep becomes skin, the planet's veins of gold become a chain around a rich man's neck. One of us signed a urinal and made the most emblematic of our arts. We more often gave the shape of waste to the art we made than giving it the shape of life, which itself appeared mainly to be waste and waiting. And before conception was the pre-dawn hour, and after death, the post-twilight of the ordure. Our literature, sporting events, political spectacles, all these too resembled excrement or its technologies. The luxury hotel ruins the view, and every true lover is ruined by love, and if not, their love is dubious. Even in beauty, we'll lay waste until the end of our days. As our species grew in number and sophistication, our waste became more noxious than feces and more enduring. Spent fuel rods, diaper bins, carbon emissions, glycophosphates, nanoplastic. We made ruins and built future ruins upon these ruins and future ruins upon these. The songbirds smashed themselves against highways' windows. The deer broke their necks on the hoods of our cars. The animals choked on our aluminum tabs, smothered themselves in plastic wrap, found themselves bereft and adrift as their habitats became strip mines and strip malls. There was nothing too cruel for us to invent out of the materials of the earth. Our shit was deadly and complex. The ancient philosopher Heraclitus, who knew we could never stand in the same river twice, died in the manner of one who has eaten the true fruit of wisdom, the one that landed us in the outhouse, the earth. And I quote, "He laid himself out in the sun and ordered some boys to smother him in cow shit. On the next day, he died stretched out that way and was buried in the agora. They say it's because he was unable to get it off. The shit remained on him. And by this change in appearance, he was eaten. He was unrecognized and then eaten by dogs. O sacred, wise, and wisdom-giving plant, the first tempter whispered in front of Milton's Eve. And our own Eve, requiring no serpent, probably whispered the same thing to the tree of corporeality. As silkworms make silk from spit, so it is that Karl Marx declared that Milton made paradise lost, and every epic of the fall, however strange and dazzling, is testimony to our species' endless excretion. And money, including the 5 pounds Milton earned for selling his poem, is an upper-level analogy for shit. All money, the dirty lucre, are greenbacks covered in fecal matter, and that which is, despite being commonly laundered, is that which can never be cleaned. Having been banished to the bathroom of the cosmos, shit or its variants is a word that fell easily from our mouths. When caught red-handed, when breaking an ankle, when setting off a landmine, when crashing a van, we exclaim shit and its myriad multilingual synonyms. It is possible that shit is our species' most popular last word, or at least second in place to a cry to God. And so we are born, and so we die, and although the future of our souls remains uncertain, eventually the corpses become another excretion of the worms. And when we have too much of anything, too many problems, too many plastic lids, too many sorrows, too many long hours on the clock and hard days on the calendar, we all gaze upon this too muchness, vexed and exhausted, and pronounce to ourselves, or to any who can hear it, I can't deal with all this shit. So it is to declare a whole era shit, as many of us began to do the year of the plague, is kin to our own act of enlightenment. For to declare the year shit is for humans to declare it with perfect candor and perfect self-recognition, the logical and truthful consequence of ourselves. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was absolutely fantastic. This is audio craziness. That's really nice music, guys. Could we turn off our sort of mute ourselves unless you're asking a question? But thank you so much, Anne. And I was just thinking, I guess I have forgotten to mention you are the opening event. Your reading is the opening event for our spring schedule for the Center for Poetry and Poetics. So that's an especially sort of a real privilege for us. So I'm just gonna kick off with a question as usual, and then I'll pass it on to Adam if you're happy with that. Don't be too worried. The question is about 500 words long, so I'm gonna try and it's kind of like actually 3 questions meandering one question into the next and to the next, and then I realized actually it's not 3 questions, it's 1, because sort of they kind of interconnect. But see what you think. And particularly interesting sort of the emotionality of your reading in the first half as well. Perhaps it is all interconnected, but I as some people know in the audience that I am definitely the person who spends about a quarter of her life in water, in a liquefied space, being obsessed with swimming, and I couldn't help but notice the trope, the recurring trope in every single book, but even in fact your recent talk, in your angiology talk as well, the concept or the trope of fluids, body fluids, other fluids, spatial, metaphorical, physical, but particularly I'm thinking here of tears and weeping and the space of weeping. So I just like made a little list for myself. For example, in Disappointed Fate, you talk about the Cartesian weeping. I just love the idea, the cause and effect, the sort of, and the kind of central source of it, you say, is a body under medication, but it's consequential. It's got a logic to it. Then in the Undying, there is a whole chapter dedicated to weeping, in fact, and you kick off with this with the reference with or to Juliet and Marcina, and in that chapter, it's my, if you don't mind me saying that, it's my favorite, one of my favorite sections, when you suggest that there should be a universal communal space where all the weepers come together. I just like, I wept when I was reading it, and so I kind of in my head I translated it as a universal weeping wall where we come to and sort of grieve, mourn. So and then of course in garments you've got the shopping figurine who weeps through the shopping mall from shop to shop, sort of almost herself becoming liquefied. And so I was thinking of this space of yours. I call it the lacrimal space, if you don't mind me kind of naming that. And elsewhere in the Undying, as well as in Disappointed Fate, you talk about a question or raise anyway the question of language's capacity to name things within their fixities, and sort of you're looking for. There is this beautiful line you say in how to go from is that there is a space where things are always awaiting or appear to want to change and maybe become something else. So I'm thinking of this kind of reappropriate idea of the tears and the weeping as a writer's space, but also it's not just writing, it's not just the space for writing, because your writing is often reading of others or contemplating or reflecting on others. So would you say it's a new, quietly revolutionary, transgressive space, this space for weeping?
You know, I don't know. I mean, because it's certainly like it, I mean, I think it'd probably be kind of narcissistic to say it was revolutionary, because, you know, we all do it all the time. But I certainly think that what you've identified is absolutely true, which is this like total interest in the in melting or substances changing. You know, I think of like Lucretius as this really sort of powerful influence on everything that I think and write, and his sort of atomic world of different aspects of life traveling through walls, like the way that scent travels. And so then, you know, for me in the past 2 years, it also turned into a kind of material practice in which I was doing all this sort of extraction of pigments and scents from natural materials, or trying to make so I did all this sort of work with plants and flowers, extracting colors and shapes and things like this, in which I would just physically work like fiber and liquid and metal and try to get this reaction, which to me seemed very similar to the same reaction of humans crying, of even something like in the Excrementalist, of this like obsessive transmogrific consumption and turning over like the stuff of the work of the world, which seems to be so fundamental to the experience of being human. And so I think that perhaps like the only thing about it because we all share it, it doesn't seem quite revolutionary, but perhaps at least when I started out writing about this stuff, I was afraid that it would be understood to be so feminized that it wouldn't be understood to be taken seriously as a part of human experience, which of course is just a ridiculous thing, that a ridiculous but legitimate thing, in which this kind of like leaking from our eyes and everywhere else is considered to be some sort of degraded feminine experience, when in fact every single entity with like a body and with form, like, you know, if I went outside and I broke off the stem of a crocus, it would also weep, right? And that every animal, everything, and every incorporated thing has the same tendency. So, but you know, fortunately, like I have enough of a rebellious tendency that I think I decided when I started writing again in my 30s, is that I wanted to dive headfirst into things that were degraded and feminized or by serious literature, and that I was going to stay with this project you know, throughout my life, that I was never going to like cheaply turn away from those aspects of experience, which I had somehow been taught were lesser because of this gender encoding of them.
Thank you so much. So maybe I'm not too far off then when I ask this question, but it's a kind of sub-question of when we say we weep, it's a sort of analeptic sort of gesture often, or a momentary one right in the present, if such a thing can exist. But especially now, so hearing your new work, but within the Undying and elsewhere, there is a sort of a gesture of four weeping, a sort of, you mentioned the word apocalyptic today several times, a sort of is a sort of a dread, you know. Hannah Arendt talks about we live in this constant dread of the future. Do you think there is a sense of that in the work as well?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, part of what the new work set off to understand is it begins before the pandemic, but trying to understand this the perpetual mood of modernity about its own death being written into its timeline from the very beginning of the conception of modernity. So the ceaseless end of the world that comes along with the rise of capitalism and the sort of like whatever these like heavily like our lives of painful like overgrown subjectivity and individuality that we experience in like certain places in the world, and sort of the industrial context. And so trying to understand that and trying to come to terms, this line that repeats again and again in this new writing is that things that fall are rightly respecting the force of their own gravity. That is how not to be caught up in nostalgic yearning for situations which are not good, but are familiar, right? So like how not to be destroyed by grief when things change, knowing as or believing as I do. I mean, I do very much believe that like this instinct toward building and repairing is incredibly strong, both in human beings and in sort of the world, the non-human world. And so because I believe that, like trying to talk myself out of that condition of spiritual remove, that is a very tempting one in times of political, social, environmental trouble. So it's this, you know, like that dialogue with myself, the thing in which I'm sure we all have been having it over the past few years, in which you're trying to move yourself into some kind of position that's just not entirely sick with world weariness or fear or nostalgia or reactionary impulses and feelings.
Okay, thank you. Adam, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just I was thinking about just thank you for the extraordinary reading, and there's one that was pretty haunting to me when you're thinking about the year of the plague and modernity, and that moment when you're thinking about death and the cruelty of the species. And then there's the poison ivy creating this sort of fire throughout the body. And I thought that was like but it's given to us with a kind of that anecdote, terrifying as it is, even though it has a kind of comedy to it. And I was just wondering whether, from the Undying, when you're sort of tracking a collective pathological state as much as a personal one, and that fusion of the private and political discourses, when you're shifting over towards this kind of more apocalyptic question, whether the genres that you have been looking at, epic, tragic, comic, and lyric, aren't enough, and that maybe the satiric is the only way. I mean, it seemed to me that the Excrementalist was just like an underlining of that. This is the only mode.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's a whole lot of these fables that keep getting written along with the other text, and so this is not the only one that has that satirical tone, and so perhaps that is the case, but that's just what it is. I mean, it's really hard. Like I don't know, everybody who's writing about these past few years, it's really hard to figure out the way to do it. I mean, this is much harder for me than anything I've ever tried to write through. And I don't think it's just because I have more pressure, because I got some success. And so now I feel like I'm supposed to like, it's like a horrible feeling like you're supposed to be able to do something good and you don't know if you're going to do anything good ever again. So it's just like, but it's always just there shouting at you. And it's still hard to figure out. So like I didn't read the part, but so my feeling about it was like, okay, I'm writing for aliens and angels. I'm like writing this chronicle that like where, I'm like just an ancient Roman writer, like writing these things, and that somebody can pick it up later. And this is the trick I play with myself. And so perhaps it's not a wonder that imagining myself to be some ancient Roman writer, I like ended up going towards satire for significant bits of what I've been writing, or at least the companion pieces. So basically, like the way it works is all these fables and stories are like footnoted inside of the other text, so that you can like find the footnote and you can go read a story or a fable. Oh, right. There's a little satirical thing that goes along with the other parts of the work.
It's sort of the satire keeps you sane though, because you can express anger and contempt and horror on the sidelines to the actual emotional core of what you're doing. Is that
Oh yeah, I mean, this is what I think. It's perhaps this is the reason it's so hard to write. I don't know if everyone else is experiencing this too. Is that because a lot of the feelings aren't necessarily like the feelings that you want to be having or that you think are okay to be having, and so there has to be a way to somehow contain the contradictory onslaught of reactions that happen. And so it is true that writing little fables gives this opportunity to put another set of another kind of emotional experience in writing.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you.
I'm going to have a couple of questions perhaps towards the end, but only if we don't have any questions. Anyone would like to ask Anna anything briefly and quickly? That is a very clear silence there. I will, actually, it's kind of, I'm so glad you mentioned the word spiritualism and sort of avoiding spiritualism and all that. And I had a cheeky look, wondering what you've been up to since the Undying, other than working full time, as you told me. This is a personal question. When do you have time to write? But that's just for full-time academics. But on the seriously, on the more formal note, I was really getting completely immersed into your latest talk you gave in Altered States. I think it was a sort of mini conference online, and you were the keynote speaker. And despite your rather informal self-introduction, which I loved, you ended up giving nearly an hour long. I can't categorize the work in any shape or form. Poetic conference paper. I don't know. I mean, of course, we by now know that we can write essay poetry and sort of, but there was something more to that. And it was going to be, you said, even yourself, you said it was meant to be about angels, but you probably end up talking about flowers. So you kind of fuse geology with the botanical, the eco, the environmental in many ways, which I loved. And there was this real tour de force of thoughts, completely disparate, matched together from the micro to the macro. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And you sort of because you mentioned the idea of anti-spiritualism, yet I felt there was this sort of almost contemporary Marxist mysticism sort of taking place there. Is this a new research, or is this again a new modus operandi for you? This real, going for the real hybrid.
Right. I mean, I started studying angels when I came to the UK at Cambridge, which was a great place. I sat in the library and I read everything I could on angels, and I actually met these wonderful experts in angelology, and have been sort of in the perpetual pursuit of the idea of the angel since I was there in the UK, which is the right place to study angels, frankly. And so, yeah, I mean, and I think that it's true. I've been, over the past few years, like I said, I tried to teach myself Greek and have been really, really taking theology seriously as an intellectual mode and trying to return to the study of religion that I was interested in when I was young, but then I went away from. I I don't know what to say about it, except for the fact that I think, like everything else, is my parents died within a year, and then suddenly confronted with that, there is this sort of movement, like this reaching for the transcendent and the things beyond human. And so that is perhaps what happened to me there. But what I've discovered, of course, is this just rich source of literature and thought, and that has the most sort of profound poetry, and is now just like, I am angry at myself for having disregarded it inside of my studies. I didn't just like disregard, I think, theology, but I just like did things like, I didn't read like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky because they're like, oh, too religious, or Kierkegaard. It's like, oh, I just made a huge mistake. I made a huge miscalculation, right? And so I've been, I guess, like a child who found out that she does like spinach after all, and now just wants to eat it all the time. And so that's kind of what's been going on with that, you know. And so that's definitely that spiritual hunger, or like the quest to understand these aspects of human experience that are the unseen or the transcendent. This is in this new work as well, I mean, which I think is really fitting with thinking about a particular moment, the apocalyptic. And then I think probably a lot of people have felt some shift in their relationship to these other kinds of things. I mean, that being said, you know, it's like I always think of like, politically, I am still a materialist. I just think it's like maybe Kierkegaard and Marx, born in the same year, have the right idea, which is that you know, Kierkegaard can sort of take the dialectic inward, and Marx is really great at taking it outward. And perhaps we need to look at both sides of that line a little bit, is perhaps how I've changed. It looks like Adam's got his hand up. You see a hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Hey, yeah, it's interesting because you, Agnes, you kind of mentioned this question about the hybrid, and it was kind of what I had in mind, so it was a bit cosmic. But yeah, I guess I was thinking about just that little mention you made there about I hope my kind of publisher kind of okays this, and it made me think about like your relationship with collecting and making a collection or a work just now, and kind of yeah, this sense of kind of meeting like the moment, and kind of having to kind of like craft a new way to do that, you know.
I don't know. I mean, I'm afraid I'm not ever going to publish anything again because I can't do it. It's just really hard, and it's really hard to compromise. And it's really, I mean, I just have so many things that I just stand in my way when it comes to like trying to think about that stuff. I mean, it's like so much easier to imagine writing a book and burying it in a hole in like a clay jar. Like that is easy to conceive of. That sounds like great and heroic. Or maybe just like a bunch of bottles in the sea. But it is really tough to try to figure out how to share work with people. And like, there's just always like, even self-publish, like every option that there is, there's still some barrier. If you publish with a small press, then it's kind of, it's just de facto elitist. Like only people in the know can get this stuff. It doesn't go to libraries. You publish with a big publisher. Well, then you're just in the meat market of publicity and self-commodification. You self-publish, then you're just like dependent on Amazon, which takes like, and so it's just like, well, like the clay jar in the ground sounds good. And then the worms can read it. Yeah. I don't know, but I know I can't do that either. I know that that's just an irresponsible fantasy. Right. And so, I mean, hopefully, so the editor of the Undying left the press, and then I stayed with the press, and then I convinced them to hire him back just to work with me, just on a freelance basis. And he's a genius. And so if anyone can like somehow help me figure out how to actually make this into a book and get it into the world, it is him. But you know, I shouldn't. I mean, God knows. Do you have any ideas?
I'm sure there'll be someone in here that'll have an idea. Thank you. That was a great answer.
Thanks, Adam. Is there anyone else who wants to come forth. Otherwise, we are going to let Anne rest and relax, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm so glad. I wish I was really in Sheffield, but I will be someday soon, I hope.
We wish it too. And as soon as you are in Great Britain, let us know, or in the UK, and then we'll straight away invite you over here, and we can cover. We can't cover, unfortunately, flights, but we can certainly cover your train and accommodation, and we would love to see you again.
Well,
I'm just going to stop the recording now.